Hi, my name is Doug Cito, Senior Technical Support Engineer for TIBCO Jaspersoft Corporation. In today's video, we're going to go over how you can troubleshoot JasperReports Server integrated with external database authentication. First, let's do a quick review of the architecture of this type of external authentication. As you can see in the diagram, the user attempts to log in to JasperReports Server. The credentials are validated against an external database where the password is stored. Assuming authentication succeeds, the user details are then retrieved from the database and passed back to the repository database for synchronization, and then the user is redirected to the user's home page. I've set up a demo environment to demo a working example of external DB authentication. Before we continue, I'd like to highlight these 4 classes you can use to add more external DB authentication logging to your jasperserver.log file. These classes should be added to log4j.properties file located in this path here. Please note, any modifications made to this file must be followed by a restart of JasperReports Server. After I log in with my test external DB user, let's take a quick look at the logging that's produced. You can see in the log a few highlights, namely the loading of the JDBC jar on line 1, the query used to look for the user on line 9, the indication that authentication succeeded on line 13, and the associated organization and roles for the user starting on line 19. Now, should you find yourself having issues with this authentication, there are some key points of failure we can look at and what some potential issues/fixes are for them. The first point of failure is the JDBC jar file. Errors related to the jar typically manifest when starting JasperReports Server. Some common errors related to the jar include using a jar that conflicts with your JVM, typically because the jar was built in an older JDK, or a class loader error. And there are several possible reasons for the error, including the fact that the JDBC jar file is not in the class path or in the lib folder of your Jasper Server web application. It could be that the driver class name in either your js.externalauth.properties file or the external data source bean of your applicationContext externalAuth-db-mt.xml file doesn't match what you have in your jar. Or it could be that the user account that's running the application server has insufficient permissions to actually read that jar file. The next point of failure is the user account used to connect to the external database, which is specified in either the js.externalauth.properties file or in the external data source bean of the applicationContext externalAuth-db-mt.xml file, in which case you'll want to check whether the username or password is correct, and by that we mean whether this combination of user credentials will allow you to log into the external database, or whether the user account has the privilege to log in. So for example, with SQL Server, there's the ability to grant or deny the permission to log in for specific user accounts. And secondly, the user should have the right privileges to see, make, and query any updates as it needs to the database. Something else to consider is the query itself. And here we have 3 points. Number 1, you want to verify that the query you're using does in fact retrieve the user that you're using to log into JasperReports Server. Second, you want to check whether the column names in your query that you have configured in your externalAuth-db-mt.xml file matches the columns that you have in your external database, which stores information like the tenant ID, username, and so forth. And finally, you'll want to make sure the query that's executed does in fact complete in the database. And what we mean is that you'll want to make sure that your DBA can verify whether the query actually completed successfully. And finally, we should take into account connectivity. And the first point is to determine whether the external database is up and running. And assuming that the database is installed on a server that's not the same server where you have JasperReports Server web application running, there are 2 things that you'll want to check. Number 1, use a third-party JDBC client to try to connect to your database, and that will help you to rule out whether there's any component in between your JasperReports server and your database that may be interfering with communication. Things like firewalls, proxies, DMZs, and so on. And second, you want to determine whether the external database is configured to accept remote connections. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Have a great day.